Hi, Lou here, and I'm going to give you some observations about designing so-called simulation games. Now, I don't like to use the word simulation with respect to games, especially tabletop. I don't know if that has anything to do with me having a PhD in military history or not. I suspect not really. I prefer to differentiate between models and wholly abstract games. So to me, Phil Saban's book, Simulating War, should be modeling war because that's what he was doing. He wasn't really simulating it. All games are, to some extent, abstractions as reality is very complex, but you can make a game that fits some reality or one that doesn't. Simulations, where you're strongly fitting reality, are a con, a mirage as far as I'm concerned, and I'll say as we go along some of the reasons why I think so. And we'll particularly be talking about war games. Warfare and games are opposites. Warfare is chaotic, confused, filled with uncertainty. I'll save you the quotes from Clausewitz and many others about this. Serious game players want to feel that they can control their fate when they play a game. They don't want a lot of uncertainty and chaos. So the more a game simulates warfare, the less many game players want to play it. So there is a small group that prefers simulation to game. They're not really interested in a game, they're interested in the history. It's much easier to represent something than to simulate it. I represent effects in my games, but I rarely represent causes. It's not practical, at least not without a lot of computer programming. And if you're doing an actual something that truly should be called a simulation, you should be simulating causes. Now, video games tend to be better simulations than tabletop, but unfortunately what they simulate tends to be unimportant things, so that a lot of video games are actually not very good models of reality. Now, I have 4 bits of advice here with a lot of detail, and I'll go over each one in turn. The first is a need for idealists. Reality is too complicated to be understood thoroughly. Think, for example, of all the disagreements among historians, among politicians, and in the United States, even among parties. There's great disagreements about what reality even is, let alone how to cope with it. Reality is definitely too complicated to be modeled accurately, quote unquote. So game design, if you're designing models, requires idealism rather than realism, or more than realism. Simplification is the key. When you're designing a game, you focus on whatever you're trying to teach or illustrate. You can't include everything, it's too complicated. When something isn't working in the design, you try to make the game simpler. Don't add something to it. That's poor design, adding things to fix things if you can possibly avoid it. Now, I use a term that comes from software engineering called a kludge. When you're writing a computer program and there's a problem and you decide to add a section to that program to fix it, then that may be a kludge because that section may not fit with how the rest of the program works. And you can do the same thing in games. You can add kludges, as I'll call them, to try to fix problems. It's much better to try to make the game simpler and somehow fix that problem as well. Now, it's easy to take any game, and I'll take my own game, Britannia, and show where things have been greatly simplified. The combat, for example, in Britannia. There's just enough detail in the combat to show that people defending difficult terrain had an advantage, and that cavalry or the Roman armies were much better than normal agricultural armies, I'd call them. Now, when you're making a model, you want what I call correspondence or analogousness, but the latter word is so awful that I stick to correspondence. And there are 3 parts to it. First, what the players do should correspond to what leaders did in reality. or in your fictional reality. It can be a fictional reality. It can be a science fiction or fantasy game. There's still a reality there. So what players do is the first thing. What happens in the game is the second thing. You want what happens in the game to be seen as similar to what happened in reality, at least some of the time. Now, obviously in games, you get peculiarities. Like people like to tell me about a Britannia game where somebody who was the Caledonians in the far north decided to go all the way down to Cornwall and managed to make it. They didn't score any points for all that. They were just doing something they thought was fun. Well, the game designer can't do anything about that. But when people are playing the game to win, to achieve their objectives, then what they do ought to be seen as something that could have happened in reality. And the third part is what strategies are pursued. Are these strategies similar to actual strategies in the situation you're modeling? If they're wildly different from what could possibly have worked in reality, then you're not making a very good model. Now, then we come to history itself. Remember, it's not inevitable. History is a combination of chaos and chance and individual choices. What actually happened is probably not the most likely thing to have happened. But some simulations are designed as puzzles. They have an always correct solution, as puzzles do, that corresponds either to what you should do or what happened in history. And in order to succeed in a game, you need to follow that always correct solution. It's not really a game, it's a puzzle. It's a different thing entirely. History is like a game, not like a puzzle. Many things can happen. And what does happen often isn't what was most likely to happen. So whether you call them simulation or model, they should not be puzzles unless you want to force a particular result. Now I'm going to give you some examples of poor simulation: Kingmaker, Eclipse, and Axis and Allies. Kingmaker sold a vast number of copies for a war game in the last century. Now I'm talking about Kingmaker, older versions of Kingmaker, not the 2022, 2023 version that's coming out. It's a clumsy game that poorly represents the actual Wars of the Roses. In particular, the mechanics strongly encourage turtling, which is sitting in place while watching others fight. The historical participants didn't have the money to turtle. Troops had to be paid. They had to settle things quickly. It's exactly the opposite. In particular, you risk in the game losing one of your nobles who represent significant parts of your army, because there's troops that come along with a noble. If you fight, even if you win the fight, it's possible your noble will die. So fighting becomes rare and stalemate occurs. And the game takes a lot longer than it needs to take. To cause fighting to happen, there are random occurrence cards that call a portion of a player's force, that is a noble, and his troops, to a usually distant location in Britain where other players can attack him at good odds. The called noble has no choice but to go, which is bizarre, and cannot take the entire army he's with, but only his particular troops. This is a kludge, and it's not even a believable kludge. But it's a solution to all the turtling, although it's a very slow solution. Nonetheless, lots of people love the game for its unpredictability and wild surprises. Again, that doesn't have much to do with history. Eclipse is a fairly recent space exploration exploitation game. And here the immense kludge is that you receive victory points for fighting. They can approach half of the total victory points. This makes no sense, especially when the loser of a fight gets victory points, even if they're wiped out. But the number of victory points gained by fighting is secret, thus avoiding the tendency in some games to analyze the bejesus out of the end game, because you don't actually know anyone's score except your own. If you know all the scores, that's when all the analysis happens. Moreover, the points are clearly intended to encourage fighting when the rest of the game encourages not fighting. The rest of the game should have been fixed, not a kludge added. Axis and Allies is an easy target because it's not really intended to be a simulation, is it? You have no supply lines or logistics. It's practical to march vast armies across Central Asia. Vast industrial plants can be established in a short time. Defenders cannot even retreat from battle. I think this is necessary to avoid perpetual back and forth attack retreat, but it's bizarre. And there are many more cases where the game just doesn't come close to fitting reality. And yet it's a very, very popular game because the people who are playing the game are not looking for heavy-duty simulation, but they liked all the little plastic pieces. So my advice is focus on making good games for your audience that can teach something about the subject. Don't worry about simulation. That's a chimera, a mirage. Thanks for listening.